I want to ask you a question that military planners in Washington have been quietly dreading for years. Not whether America can win the opening battles of a ground invasion of Iran. It almost certainly can. American forces would cross the border with overwhelming firepower, superior air support, and the most advanced military technology in human history. The early engagements would likely go exactly as planned. The question that matters is different. It is this: where does that army get trapped? Because every serious analyst who has studied this problem, every intelligence officer, every military historian, every strategist who has looked at the maps and run the models arrives at the same conclusion. A ground invasion of Iran does not end with victory. It ends with entrapment. A slow, grinding, politically catastrophic entrapment from which there is no clean exit. And the trap is not built from Iranian military strength alone. It is built from something far more difficult to bomb your way through. It is built from geography, from logistics, from history, from the particular kind of will that a civilization develops when it has been fighting for its survival for 2,500 years. My name is Jiang Xueqin. I teach predictive history, the use of game theory and civilizational pattern recognition to understand where conflicts are heading before they arrive. In 2024, I predicted that America would go to war with Iran. That prediction has come true. Today, I want to show you what comes next. Not the air war, the ground war, the trap that is waiting at the bottom of the escalation ladder, and why once American boots touch Iranian soil, the logic of that trap begins operating with a mechanical inevitability that no amount of military superiority can override. To understand why Iran is different, you first have to understand why Iraq created the wrong mental model. In March 2003, the United States invaded Iraq. In 3 weeks, American forces reached Baghdad. The government collapsed. Saddam Hussein's statue came down on live television. It looked to most observers like a demonstration of what modern American military power could achieve. That image, the fast invasion, the rapid collapse, the enemy government dissolving within weeks, became the template through which most people now visualize war. They expect conflicts to work that way: fast, decisive, technology triumphing over resistance. But here's what that image concealed. Iraq, at the moment of invasion, was a country that had been devastated by a decade of sanctions, weakened by 2 prior wars, and was ruled by a government that had spent 30 years hollowing out every institution around it to prevent internal challenges to its power. The army that collapsed in 3 weeks collapsed partly because it had been systematically undermined by the very government it was supposed to defend. Iran is the structural opposite of that situation in almost every relevant dimension. Iran covers more than 1.6 million square kilometers. That is larger than Iraq and Afghanistan combined. It has a population of over 85 million people. It has a professional military that has not been hollowed out, but has spent the last 2 decades specifically preparing for this confrontation. It has a religious and civilizational framework that frames this conflict not as a political dispute, but as an existential war of survival. And it has terrain, I will come back to this, that is among the most defensively advantageous on Earth. Anyone who looks at Iraq in 2003 and concludes that Iran would be similar is not making a military assessment. They are making a wish. Before a single American soldier fires a shot inside Iran, the military faces a problem so fundamental that it shapes everything that follows. Where do you stage the invasion from? This is not a trivial question. You cannot deploy 500,000 soldiers to the other side of the world without first establishing massive logistical infrastructure, staging areas, supply depots, fuel storage, medical facilities, communications networks. All of it has to exist before the first major combat operation begins. In 2003, the answer was straightforward: Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, the Gulf bases that America had been maintaining for decades with governments that were, at that moment, willing to cooperate. That environment no longer exists in the same form. Iraq today has a government with deep institutional connections to Iran, a government that has explicitly stated it will not allow its territory to be used as a staging ground for military operations against its neighbor. If Washington attempts to use Iraqi bases for a large-scale invasion, it risks destabilizing the very country it spent 20 years and trillions of dollars attempting to rebuild. The political backlash inside Iraq would be immediate and severe. Turkey is technically a NATO ally, but Ankara has its own complex strategic interests and its own calculation about what it can absorb. Turkish leadership has consistently demonstrated that alliance membership does not translate into automatic participation in wars that could send Iranian missiles toward Turkish cities, disrupt Turkish trade routes, and flood Turkish borders with refugees. That corridor is functionally closed. What remains is the Gulf, carriers in the Persian Gulf, bases in Qatar, Bahrain, and the UAE. And this is where the first structural trap begins to close. Because everything, every soldier, every bullet, every gallon of fuel, every replacement part, every unit of food and water has to travel through supply lines that stretch across thousands of miles of ocean, through the Persian Gulf, and into a theater of operations that Iran has spent 20 years preparing to make as painful as possible. A modern army does not run on courage, it runs on logistics. And logistics running through the Persian Gulf run directly past Iran's coastline, past its mountain-embedded missile batteries, past its fast attack boat squadrons operating in the shallow waters where American carriers are most vulnerable. Iran does not need to defeat the American military to win the logistics war. It only needs to make the supply lines slow, unpredictable, and expensive. And it has been building exactly that capability for 2 decades. Now I want to talk about the terrain, because this is the element that most news coverage ignores completely, and it is the element that military historians consider decisive. Open a topographical map of Iran. What you see immediately is that this is not a flat country. It is a country dominated by 2 massive mountain systems. In the west, running hundreds of miles along the Iraqi and Turkish borders, the Zagros Mountains, steep, rugged, filled with narrow valleys and natural choke points where a small defending force on high ground can stop an armored column completely. Heavy vehicles cannot maneuver off the roads. Convoys are forced onto predictable routes. And predictability on a battlefield is, as every military strategist knows, fatal. In the north, the Alborz range, with peaks exceeding 4,000 meters, snow, fog, temperatures that ground aircraft and reduce ground movement to a crawl for months at a time. Supply lines that are already stretched across thousands of miles become exponentially more fragile in these conditions. Iran has spent 20 years doing one specific thing in these mountains. Not building a conventional army designed to meet American forces in open terrain. It knows it cannot win that fight. Instead, it has been embedding missile systems, drone launch sites, ammunition caches, tunnel networks, and prepared defensive positions deep into the rock itself, hidden, protected, largely immune to airstrikes. Let me make this concrete. Imagine a military convoy entering a narrow mountain pass. The vehicles stretch out along the road because there is no physical space to maneuver off it. The column becomes what military planners call a linear target, a long, vulnerable ribbon of steel moving through terrain where everything above it is controlled by the defender. The lead vehicles and the rear vehicles are destroyed simultaneously. The entire convoy is frozen. Rockets and mortars rain down from positions on the hillsides that were dug months or years earlier. By the time air support arrives, the attackers have disappeared back into the terrain they know intimately, and the invading force does not. This is not a hypothetical scenario. It is a pattern that has repeated itself in every mountain conflict in modern military history. The mountains have always favored the defender. They favored the Afghans against the Soviets. They favored the Afghans against the Americans. They will favor the Iranians against whoever comes next. And Iran is not the Afghans. Iran is an organized, technologically sophisticated state that has had 2 decades to study exactly how America fights and to prepare the specific countermeasures that the terrain makes possible. Now, I want to add a dimension that most military analysis of Iran understates. Iran does not fight alone. Over 30 years, Iran has constructed what its military doctrine calls the axis of resistance, a network of allied organizations, partner militias, and proxy forces distributed across the broader Middle East. Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthis in Yemen, Shia militias in Iraq, partner organizations in Syria, groups with varying degrees of capability and independence, but all connected to Iranian logistics, Iranian training, and Iranian strategic direction. The purpose of this network is not primarily to project Iranian power in peacetime. Its purpose is activated in exactly the scenario we are discussing, a direct military assault on Iranian territory. If American ground forces invade Iran, that network does not wait to see how the fighting goes. It activates simultaneously across the entire region. American bases in Iraq face sustained missile and drone attacks. Shipping lanes through the Red Sea and the Persian Gulf face coordinated disruption. Energy infrastructure across the Gulf, pipelines, refineries, desalination plants, export terminals becomes an active battlefield. The Strait of Hormuz, through which 20% of the world's traded oil passes every day, comes under threat. The economic consequences ripple outward almost immediately. Oil prices spike. Global supply chains are disrupted. Insurance costs for cargo shipping in the region multiply overnight. Financial markets respond to the uncertainty with the particular violence they reserve for situations where the parameters of risk are suddenly unknown. Every government that initially supported the campaign now faces its own domestic political pressure. Allies begin calculating whether the strategic objective, whatever it actually is worth the economic pain being imposed on their own populations. The coalition that launched the invasion begins to fracture before the invasion has achieved anything decisive. And Washington faces a calculation that has no good answer. Escalate against the network, and the war expands geographically in ways that make the original objective even harder to achieve. Ignore the network, and American forces in Iran are being bled from outside the country's borders by adversaries who cannot be reached without opening additional fronts. This is the regional dimension of the trap. And it was not improvised, it was constructed deliberately over decades, precisely for this moment. I want to step back from the battlefield now and look at what is happening simultaneously in the United States. Because wars are not fought only on foreign soil. They are fought in the political arena, in the media, in the economic data that citizens experience in their daily lives, and in the streets of cities far from the fighting. The American public is not, at this moment, a population prepared for the sacrifices a ground war in Iran would require. Polling conducted before this conflict began showed 70 to 80% opposition to military engagement with Iran. That is an extraordinary number. It means that even before a single American soldier is killed, before a single flag-draped coffin comes home, the domestic political foundation for this war is already compromised. Now begin adding the costs. The financial cost of a prolonged ground campaign in Iran, a country larger than Iraq and Afghanistan combined, with a more capable military and more defensible terrain, would be measured in trillions of dollars. Against a domestic backdrop of inflation, housing unaffordability, stagnant wages for large portions of the working population, and a political system already fractured along lines that this war will deepen rather than heal. Then begin adding the casualties, because casualties are the variable that changes everything. The American public can sustain a war that is won quickly and decisively. It cannot sustain a war that produces a steady, visible, weekly stream of deaths with no clear path to victory and no honest answer to the question, what exactly are we achieving? Vietnam began with broad public support and fractured American society within 3 years. Afghanistan began with near-unanimous public support after the September 11th attacks and ended 20 years later with the most humiliating military withdrawal in American history. Iran would not take 20 years to fracture domestic political will, because the American public in 2025 is not the American public of 2001. It is more skeptical, more divided, more economically stressed, and more aware through social media, through independent journalism, through the lived experience of two failed wars, of the gap between what political leaders promise and what military interventions actually deliver. The home front is not a secondary consideration. In a conflict of attrition, it is the decisive front. And the domestic political foundation for this war was already cracking before the first ground troops landed. And now I want to go deeper than the military analysis, because everything I have described so far, the staging problem, the mountains, the supply lines, the network, the home front, is real and it is important, but it is still the surface layer. The deepest layer of the Iran trap is civilizational, and it is the layer that Washington is least equipped to understand. I have argued for years that the most important distinction in geopolitics is not between strong militaries and weak ones. It is between what I call warrior cultures and consumer cultures. The distinction is not about weapons or technology. It is about what a population is genuinely willing to sacrifice, about the depth of the conviction that the fight is worth whatever it costs. Consumer cultures organize themselves around material prosperity. Their citizens evaluate their governments based on living standards, economic conditions, the price of gasoline and groceries. When wars become expensive in lives and in money, public support erodes and political pressure to withdraw becomes overwhelming. This is not a weakness unique to America. It is a structural feature of all prosperous societies organized around individual material comfort. Warrior cultures emerge from something different, from existential threat, from a historical memory of invasion, of occupation, of civilizational near death, from a religious or ideological framework that gives the sacrifice meaning beyond the individual. Iran has been invaded by Greeks, Arabs, Mongols, Turks, and Russians. Its modern history includes the 1953 CIA-backed coup that overthrew its elected government, 8 years of devastating war with Iraq that the United States actively supported, decades of sanctions, assassinations of its scientists, sabotage of its nuclear facilities, and the constant explicit threat of regime change from the most powerful military force in human history. That history does not produce a passive population waiting to be liberated. It produces a civilization with a deep bone-level understanding of what foreign occupation means and a correspondingly deep conviction about what must be done to prevent it. In Iran's religious and political framework, and these two things are genuinely inseparable in a way that secular Western analysis consistently fails to understand, this conflict is not a policy dispute. It is a sacred war of civilizational survival against what their theology explicitly identifies as the forces of corruption and domination. That is not rhetoric deployed for domestic consumption. That is a genuine belief held with genuine conviction by the people making the decisions and by a significant portion of the population that will be asked to fight. A population fighting from that conviction will absorb a level of punishment that no consumer society, no society where the government's legitimacy rests on delivering material comfort, is politically capable of matching. This asymmetry of will is not incidental to the military analysis. It is the military analysis. Because wars of attrition are not decided by who has more weapons. They are decided by who runs out of political will first. And in a contest of political will between a warrior culture fighting on its own soil for its civilizational survival and a consumer culture fighting an optional war 8,000 miles from home for objectives its own population cannot clearly articulate, the outcome is not a prediction. It is a pattern, one that has repeated itself with remarkable consistency throughout modern history. Let me bring all of this together because it is the interaction between these factors that makes the Iran trap so difficult to escape once entered. Geography channels invading forces into terrain where defenders have every advantage. Logistics stretched across thousands of miles through hostile waters become the army's most critical vulnerability. The regional network activates across multiple fronts simultaneously, expanding the war faster than anyone planned. Domestic political will, already fragile before the first shot, begins eroding under the weight of casualties and costs. And against all of this, an adversary whose civilizational framework tells it that this is a sacred war of survival that must be won regardless of the cost. Each of these factors would be a serious problem individually. Together, they form a system, an interlocking set of pressures that tightens with every week the campaign continues and every additional commitment made to salvage the previous ones. This is mission creep in its most dangerous form, not the casual drift of an operation that gradually expands beyond its original scope, but a structural trap that was engineered to capture exactly the kind of force that America would send: technologically superior, logistically dependent, politically constrained, and fighting without the civilizational conviction that makes a population willing to absorb unlimited punishment. The deeper the force advances, the more politically impossible withdrawal becomes. The more politically impossible withdrawal becomes, the more troops and resources get committed. The more resources get committed, the more the domestic political crisis deepens. The more the domestic crisis deepens, the more desperate the military decisions become. And the more desperate the military decisions, the more the trap tightens. None of this is secret knowledge. The maps exist. The historical case studies are unambiguous. The intelligence assessments, the classified ones, the ones written by people who understand exactly what a ground invasion of Iran would require, have almost certainly reached the same conclusions I am reaching here. The problem is never the absence of information. The problem is the peculiarly human tendency to believe that this time will be different, that this army is better trained, that this technology is more advanced, that this enemy is weaker than the historical record suggests. That tendency, that combination of strategic overconfidence, domestic political pressure, and the momentum of escalation is precisely the mechanism by which great powers walk knowingly into traps they can see perfectly clearly. It is how Athens lost its empire in Sicily. It is how Napoleon lost his army in Russia. It is how America lost its strategic position in Vietnam and Afghanistan. And it is the mechanism that is operating right now in real time as the escalation ladder points downward toward the ground. I began by asking where the army gets trapped. The answer, as I hope is now clear, is not a single location on a map. The trap is the entire environment: physical, logistical, political, regional, and civilizational, that begins operating the moment ground forces cross the border. The mountains trap the convoys. The supply lines trap the logistics. The regional network traps the strategic options, the domestic politics trap the decision makers, and the civilizational asymmetry traps the will, because you cannot sustain a war of attrition against a population that genuinely believes it is fighting for its survival when your own population is asking with increasing urgency what exactly we are doing there and when exactly we are coming home. This is the Iran trap, not a trap Iran set last month. A trap it has been engineering, with patience and strategic clarity, for 20 years. The question is not whether the trap exists. Anyone who has studied the maps and the history knows it does. The question is whether the people with the power to make the decision will find the political courage to step back from it before the momentum of escalation makes that choice for them. History suggests the answer, but history is not destiny, and that is the only source of hope I can offer you today.